Welcome. Join us for another session. Pastor Bob, the Pastor Study. Grab yourself a cold iced tea and join us for a little conversation on Bible study on one of the most exciting stories anywhere in Scripture. It just blows my mind. I got to give you a quick background. I've been a pastor teaching people about how important Jesus Christ is and what a wonderful event in history it was when he came into the world as the Word who was made flesh and dwelt among us, who was with God in the creation and through whom everything was made. That was made. But I'm also a science nut, and I enjoy reading and studying about SpaceX and travel to Mars and the nuclear accelerator in France, and I get a little queasy in my stomach when we start talking about quantum physics. That's a little bit of a stretch for me. But I enjoy science and I enjoy faith, and I don't see them as divergent subjects. I see them as unified subjects that all tie together. And we're going to look at some of that today because it is the most exciting story any place. And if you haven't dug into this, this is worth your time, because Jesus doesn't do anything by accident, by just random happening. It was done with purpose. It was done with a teaching goal in mind. And we just have to dig in and learn from it. And, okay, so the lesson for today comes from Luke, the 9th chapter, and the 28th verse. And it's called, if you have a Bible with those little headings at the end of, or at the beginning of each little section, it's called the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration. You can actually read about it in 3 different places. Matthew tells the story in chapter 17, verses 1 through 8. Mark tells the story in chapters 9, verses 2 through 8. And Luke tells the story in chapter 9, 28 through 36. Each of the 3 synoptic gospels tell this story because it is so important. It is so fundamental to their understanding of who Jesus is. So I want you to, kind of close your eyes and picture what's happening here. So if you can close your eyes and not fall asleep, hang with me. If you can see Jesus having taken 3 of his disciples, Peter, James, and John, and taken them up on the mountain away from the rest of the disciples, and they're up there a long time. He's praying, they're sleeping. That happens a lot. I think Jesus is a prayer, and they're just really tired. I'm sorry. As someone who enjoys sleeping, I can kind of identify with that. But buckle your seatbelts, because we're just about to take a very exciting ride. In Luke, now reading from chapter 9, verse 28, about 8 days after Jesus had been declared the Messiah, Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus tells them he's predicting his death when he is going to go to Jerusalem for the last time. And so there's a lot that's happened right there at the middle of this story in Luke. And it is the turning point of Jesus' ministry. He's a nice guy, interesting teacher, powerful healer. But suddenly, he is the Messiah. And that changes everything, because he starts to define what Messiah means. And so he tells them what it means. He's going to be killed when he goes to Jerusalem. He tells them, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for me will save it. He's redefining what it means to be Savior, Lord. Now, we have completed 8 days. Verse 28. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up into a mountain to pray. The mountain is called Mount Tabor. I was there. It's a gigantic, big, round lump in the ground. Not like some of the Rocky Mountains and things we have out here, but a big grassy, round bump in the earth. All right? And up on top of that, they're praying, removed from the people around them and the rest of the disciples. Verse 29, as he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment in Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said, Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. And the scripture then says he didn't know what he was saying. Okay? While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them. They were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came out of the cloud saying, This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. And the disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anybody at the time what they had seen. Now, you just let your mind roll on this for just a few moments. All right, with me. Go with me for a second. Don't let your eyes gloss over, because I'm going to talk about Einstein. He came up with a formula. It was called E equals mc squared. Basically, it's a formula that says you can't create anything from nothing. And you can't destroy anything, ultimately. Because if you take matter and you blow it up, all you've done is changed it from a physical matter to a form of energy. And so everything is almost like polar opposites in the universe. One is energy, like light and heat, and matter, which is things you can touch and feel, like stones or like your toothbrush or something you can hold in your fingers. It's matter or it's energy. But there's also another thing that's involved in that. In order to get this calculation correct, you have to throw in time. Time, material, energy are all connected in the formula that Einstein came up to with his theory of relativity. Because you have to take the speed of light squared. That speed, time. Time is a calculation of a passage of a unit or a moment in time. Every kid knows how to ask the question, how fast does it go? How many miles an hour? What's the speed in a quarter mile? Everybody knows it. The miles per hour is miles, distance, per time. The speed of light is a specific speed that a wavelength of light will move in 1 second. And so if you take the time and the distance, you get a formula for everything that exists. Matter on one side, energy on the other side, and somehow connected through this thing with time. I borrowed Judy's necklace. It looks like pearls, but I think they're manufactured. I'm pretty sure they're manufactured. Okay, how does this relate? We, meaning you and I, and everybody that's ever lived, live in the reality of time. Okay? It's simply the way things operate. So let me just take this for a second. All right. I'm going to hold the rest of this in my hand. When we are born, and as we go through our childhood, we live our years. And as we have a birthday, just had one last week, we add a little length to our timeline that we have lived. Okay, if you see, I just passed my 72nd birthday. Click, I get to put another bead, another pearl, on the line of pearls of my life. This is the way we experience time. It's linear. It's 1 year, 1 day, 1 month, 1 decade at a time. And as you add years, the string just gets longer and longer. Okay, do you follow? Time, for our lifetimes, is linear. If you were young and you wished you were old, you just don't all of a sudden end up with a lot of years. You have to live each year in its order. Okay, so when you get to the end, like I am down here at the end, you go, wow, I can see now how all of this thing fits together, because I now have the perspective of years, one at a time, and slowly you get the perspective of time. So what happens if I take all of these and I hold them in my hand all at one time? Are they linear anymore? Listen to what happens. 2 men were standing with Jesus. One was Moses, and one was Elijah. Okay, and all three agree. All 3 of the Gospels say the very same thing. It was Moses and it was Elijah. But they had lived long before Jesus was born. Moses led the people out of Egypt, let's say roughly 1,500 years before this story happened. 1,500 years. Elijah was in the time of the prophets and the 2 kingdoms, Israel and Judah. The time of Ahab, the great evil king. Elijah was 850 years before Jesus. If you remember, he was the one that was taken up in the chariot of fire and didn't actually die. God sent a chariot and swept him up and took him into heaven without ever having to go through a funeral. Okay. Now, I want to just stop and say for a second, if Moses was 1,500 years and Elijah was only half of that, let's say 800 years, how did they get with Jesus? See, this is where the story gets fun. This is where it gets really interesting. Because 1,500 years is just like today. And 800 years is identical to today in eternity. And they were talking about events that were going to take place in Jesus' life as he got to Jerusalem at the end of his life. So they were actually talking not just about what happened during their lifetimes, they're talking about what he can look forward to in the future. So time in eternity is like taking all the pearls in our necklace and disconnecting them and putting them in a bucket, and they're all together. They're not in a line. They're not in a line anymore. Eternity takes every pearl that's ever been lived or ever will live and puts them together so that what has happened in the past is the same as what is happening now, and what is happening now is exactly the same and just as knowledgeable, just as much a known quantity as what will happen in the future. Time. My friends in the scientific community say that's impossible. You can't go backwards in time. You can't revisit what happened in the past. You can't go back and talk with Einstein, for instance. You can't go back and talk with Aristotle. It isn't possible to have an interview with Alexander the Great. Time has passed for those things, for those people. But Jesus teaches us not only that he has immense divine power, because if you remember the story of Moses and receiving the tablets of stone on Mount Sinai, he was able to glance just for a moment the passage of God's divine presence as God passed by him and had covered him with his hand, and then just at the last second before he disappeared, took his hand away, and Moses got just the tiniest little glimpse of God's presence, his eternal nature. And just from that moment, the face of Moses, the appearance of Moses, took on a radiant glow. He shone with the radiance left over from his presence with Almighty God. And he didn't even realize it. I mean, it wasn't like a nightlight or something that kept you awake at night. It was the presence of God that still radiated out of him. But when he came down from the mountain, people looked at him and, Moses, you have changed. Something's happened to you. Well, if you look at what's in this story, two men, Moses and Elijah, both they knew exactly who they were. They had perfect knowledge of who was standing with Jesus, even though it was long before there were pictures or videos of these people that they could actually compare to what was before. They just knew who it was, which is another part of the amazing part of eternity. And they were in glorious splendor. They were dressed in glorious splendor. Oh, I'd love to just sit and spend about a week studying about glorious splendor and how they were dressed, how they were attired. But Jesus was even more shocking because his face was glowing, and each of the three Gospels tells it differently. They said his appearance, his clothing, was so bright, it was so white, it was so radiant, that Luke says it was as bright as a flash of lightning. Now, if you've looked at a flash of lightning, it hurts your eyes. If you're close to one of those flashes and you get a chance to just take it in, your eyes are going to burn for a long time afterwards because it is so bright. But it is shockingly bright. And his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. And his face was changed. Let me prayerfully give you something to think about here. This story should, if you listen to it and pay attention, should blow your mind. Should blow your mind because it fits. Because it is so big in its meaning that it won't fit into your head. As limited as our heads can be, our minds can be. I once had a young man whose wife was fighting cancer, and he kept telling me this wonderful spiel that he'd been taught in salesman's class teaching, that you can overcome anything with a positive, mental attitude, and you can overcome this. We're going to beat this deal. We're going to be able to overcome this bone cancer, and we're not going to have a problem. And I said, Jack, you're dealing with a world that is this big in your mind, when really the world is this big. And it's not possible for you to get your mind around that right now. Well, that's what this is today. When we read about the transfiguration of Jesus and how he's getting helpers, he's getting counsel, he's getting advice, he's getting information from men who had died over, in Moses' case, over 1,000 years before. In Elijah's case, hundreds of years before, about what's going to happen in the future. Time is irrelevant. Time is not linear like it is for us. I want you to know that Jesus Christ is the Lord, the Creator, the boss of time. He's the boss of matter. He is the boss of energy. He is the boss of every element that Einstein referred to in his little equation. And his equation, while it's very powerful, is kindergarten stuff to Jesus, because he was the one who put it together. He's the one who fit the pieces into their proper place, put the pieces together. And you say to me, Pastor Bob, I can't understand that. I don't understand what it means. I don't understand how to fit that in my head. Well, let me just give you one more example that helps me. I want to just flip back, if I can, to the Gospel of John. John writes in his gospel that there are 7 proofs that Jesus was and is and continues to be through all of time and eternity the Messiah, the one who was sent from God to teach us what God was like and what power he had and how we have that assurance of who is walking with us, who is sharing with us, who is reaching out his hand to us. In chapter 6 of John, we have the 5th of the 7 miraculous signs. And I'm going to just jump through. I mean, yes, there's a storm. Yes, there is a hurricane pushing against the boat. They're on the Sea of Galilee. And in verse 19, 6:19, it says, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. Now, they were going across the lake, and the lake is between 7 and 8 miles wide. So they were right dead center, in the center of the lake. These are not tourists. They're not new to the area. These are men who spent their entire lives on this lake. They knew exactly where they were. They knew exactly where the location was, and they were pulling for all their might to try and get to the other side, but the wind was against them. The waves were against them. And they were not making any progress. They were stuck 3 to 4 miles away from where they were hoping to eventually go. But the wind was against them and they couldn't make any progress. They saw Jesus approaching. It is I. Don't be afraid. Then, verse 21, they were willing to take him into the boat. Listen now to the next words. And as he stepped over the gunwales of the boat, as he entered the boat, immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. It didn't say they were blown ashore someplace. It didn't say they just suddenly realized that their calculations had been wrong. The entire boat and all the people and all the materials that they had with them, all their supplies, everything that was there was suddenly picked up and transported 3 to 4 miles to exactly where they were supposed to be, instantaneously. It didn't say they fell asleep, and when they woke up, Jesus had somehow guided the boat so that it went through the water. They were instantly, immediately, in total, among all of them, transported to the exact location they were supposed to be. And that was 3 to 4 miles away. E equals mc, the speed of light, squared. I'm sorry. Science says you can't do that. You're not allowed. You can't do it. It doesn't fit within the formula. Your matter cannot be displaced. You can blow the boat up and change it from matter to energy. In some kind of creative way, you might be able to make energy and make a boat, at least theoretically, out of energy. And you have to figure in a square of the speed of light to be able to even do that. And Jesus simply did it. It wasn't a big deal for him. He just was. And there they were with him. Please close your eyes for just a second and think about this for a second. We are in very uncertain days. We've got millions of people out of work. We've got hundreds of thousands of businesses that are just barely hanging on economically. We have major challenges with race relationships between the races and in the political spectrum of all the things going on. We are in a very strange moment in human history, in the nation's history. You know something? God already sees what the result is going to be. God already knows what the outcome of all of our stresses and strains, our trials and sufferings we're going through right now. He knows exactly what the final total of COVID-19 is going to cost us in the terms of the number of lives. He knows what is going to take place all the way from here to eternity. Do not think for 1 second that somehow he's surprised by what's taking place. He has an eternal plan, just like Moses and Elijah spoke to Jesus about. There is a plan. We can look forward to what comes next. We can be excited about what comes next. We can be prepared for what comes next because God knows. And He's got it. And if He chose, He could send Moses and Elijah and sit here in the pastor's study with me and explain it to me. It's not going to happen, of course. I want you to know, but that doesn't change the godness of God or the greatness of the Messiah that Jesus is. Jesus knew exactly what to expect. He knew exactly who was going to betray him and why. He knew exactly what the leaders of the temple hierarchy were going to do. He knew how they were going to react. He knew what the Roman leaders were going to do and who was going to be the one who would make the decision. They took him to Herod Antipas in that last day of his life. And Jesus wouldn't even speak to Herod. He wasn't going to make a difference in the story. Herod wasn't one of the players. He knew that. God didn't have him included in the program. It was Pilate. And so he went back to Pilate. You see, we are in the middle of God's eternal plan. And no matter where you are in your lifetime, in eternity terms, He has taken every one of these pearls and disconnected them and put them into a nice big barrel. And each one is in His control. He could take us back in time. He could take us forward in time. He could take us from one place in this physical world and transport us to another place. He could take us from this moment into the future. He holds every single pearl, every year, every moment of our lives in His hand. The story of the Transfiguration is a story of wonderful amazement when God opens a little crack in the veil between eternity and our world, and we get a chance to just see the tiniest little opening in the veil between time and eternity. But it teaches us so much about what heaven is like and how the events of earth fit together in God's eternal plan. 1,000 years is like a moment. 1,000,000 years is hardly that long. God doesn't care. He has no need of our calculators of time, our calendars, our calculations of how long it takes to get from here to there, and how many years it takes to develop this into that. All he has to do is speak the words. E equals mc squared is irrelevant in God's heart and mind and in his creation. It's just set up to give us a little sense of predictability in our world, but it doesn't limit his power. I hope that's an interesting lesson for you. I hope it's something that captures your imagination. I want you to be able to pray in a way that says, my life in every moment of my existence has been in your hands. My future, whatever might that be, however long that might be, is in your hands. You measure them out to us one day at a time. But that doesn't limit you and what you want to accomplish in us. I want you to be able to pray and see in your mind's eye Moses and Elijah. Yeah. Moses, the great lawgiver, the nation builder, the society architect. Elijah, the great man of God of faith, the rock that delivered Israel from the depths of an evil, corrupt, depraved man and his leadership. I want you to be able to pray and say, these men standing alongside of Jesus are just smiling over you. Do you see them smiling over you? They know what happens next. They know what God's plan is and how it's going to develop. They are completely aware of how uncertain life can be for us, but doesn't have to be, because we can depend on God's wisdom, his grace, and his eternal power to keep everything in the center of his great plan. The story of the transfiguration of Jesus is important because it happens in all three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But it's just as important in the Gospel of John, where he has power over time and space, material and energy. He is the Lord of our entire creation and eternity. May God bless you as you let your mind breathe over that reality again and again. Read that story again in each one of the Gospels. More radiant than the sun, brighter than a flash of lightning, whiter than anything this world can produce. All of the three Gospels tried to get that picture in our minds. Something amazing was happening on top of that mountain so that we could know the truth about what God's plan was all about. I hope that was a blessing to you. God bless you. God keep you in the center of his hand. Amen.